Hello, and welcome to part 4 of this webcast series. In this video, we're going to look at how to create a login dialog so that when a user navigates to the Twitter page, behind the scenes, we want to check in the data handler to determine if the user has Twitter credentials. If the user does not have Twitter credentials, then we want to open up the login dialog and give the user the opportunity to submit his credentials, which will then be stored encrypted in the database and then used by the archive provider in order to populate the archive control with rows of information from Twitter. So let's go ahead and focus on that Twitter dialog, or the login dialog, and see how we might get that to work. So here I am back in Visual Studio, and what I'm going to do is just do Control O in order to open up our SO Twitter login page. I'll go ahead and open that up, and it's a blank file at this point. What I want to do is to begin defining this page so that we can get the login credentials to display. So I've taken the liberty to paste in some code here so that you didn't have to watch me type this all in. Essentially, I've defined a new page element, and I've given it a unique ID called ID Twitter login page. This is going to make up our dialog actually for the Twitter login. I'll assign it a title element called Twitter login. We'll see this in the title bar of the dialog when it appears. I'm not going to define any data handlers at this point. We'll come back to that. That's in the next video. And I'm going to define this panels element, which contains our single panel. Now, almost all dialogs inside SuperOffice have a panel type of type SO dialog panel. I'm going to assign it an ID of main panel. If we look at the rest of the attributes here, panel type equals main, and we're going to set the SO protocol, if you remember, equal to the name of the dialog. So this is going to be true for all panel elements. The SO protocol defined in a panel is going to be the same name as the dialog. So SO protocol equals Twitter login. Right, so Twitter login. Great. Next we get to the cards element, which contains a single card for this dialog, and it's going to be given a unique ID, main card. The type is of type SO card. It's the most basic card that is in the framework. We're going to assign it a placeholder called main dialog card. We're going to assign it a card type of main card, and then set the position into absolute. Top is going to be all the way to the top at 0 pixels, and height 100%. Has a views element, which at this point contains a single view. It will only contain a single view. ID is a unique ID, main view. Type is going to be SO plain view. And then we're going to go ahead and assign the SO protocol of main. In here we right now have a single control group and a control groups element, and we've assigned it a unique ID, main header group. We're assign this type as an SO control group, and we're going to position it absolutely left 0 pixels, and from the top we're going to drop it down a little bit and say 5 pixels from the top. Now this is like a bare bones dialog. There's nothing special here at this point. There's no controls that are defined here within the controls element. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and now we want some way in order to test it and bring it up inside the browser. So if we come back here, we want to be able to actually display that login dialog. How do we do that? Well, one of the built-in controls is called an SO script control, and we can leverage that right in the Twitter control that we have defined, or the Twitter panel. So if we go back into the code, I'm going to switch back to the Twitter page and show you what I mean. We're going to essentially invoke JavaScript that is going to open that dialog for us. So we haven't declared any controls in this control group yet, so let's do that now. I'm going to go ahead and paste this in. I had on the clipboard an SO script control. So it's a control of type SO script control, has a unique ID. I'll just call it Twitter script. And inside the config section of this control defines how this script, or what this script control is going to behave, how it's going to behave. The idea here is it has a single switch statement, and a single switch statement can have many case elements. Here we're going to simply define that this value of a variable is equal to 1. We're not going to establish any binding at this point, and we're going to see how this all kind of works to our advantage when we begin to introduce the data handler and data carriers, because we can actually set this binding to data and then actually check the value of a property inside a carrier. But we're just going to keep it simple at this point. So we'll say switch on value 1. Now case where the value equals 1. So we're going to say the operator equals and value is 1. So it's going to say, okay, check if this value equals 1, then they're going to match, and therefore execute this script. So the script control will render this JavaScript inside the browser and execute it when the page is finished loading. And then the actual script is actually, we're calling into the dialog JavaScript object, invoking the open method, which takes in 3 parameters. The first parameter is the name of the dialog, and then the second parameter is the SO protocol that we want to invoke. So we're going to execute the SO protocol for this dialog, Twitter login, and that will address the SO protocol in the panel. Whenever you're opening up a dialog, you're always going to want to include this square brackets dialog equals stop routine. That way the dialog, when it opens, it will stay open. And lastly, the third parameter is a callback that we want to be executed after this dialog has been closed. There's nothing that we want to do like that at this point, but we will see how that callback is effective after we have the archive control written into this page. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that. And so what should happen now is when we go to the browser and we click on the company tab, when I click back on the Twitter page, it should render that Twitter page, and then the script control will invoke, check if the value 1 equals 1, and if it does, it will go ahead and execute that script. So let's see if that works. Right. So it looks like it's working correctly. I clicked on that, I opened the page, the script executed, and it went ahead and called the dialog.open method and opened our dialog. So we know that that's working up to this point. So that's great. Now that we have ensured the dialog appears correctly, we're going to navigate back to our Login Dialog code, and it's time to start writing in some controls. So now we want to focus on how writing controls in the controls element is going to leverage the group type grid. So I'm going to go ahead and just start off writing the first control. We'll give this an ID of Twitter image, because we want to actually show like our logo for the Twitter application. It's going to be of type SO image. This is a built-in type that you can go ahead and leverage. And now we want to kind of associate this control with the grid, or with the table. So we have to specify what row and column it's going to exist in. So I'm going to say row equals 0, and I'll give it a column equals 0. It's going to appear in the upper left. Great. We can also optionally give it a tooltip, so that when you hover over the image, a tooltip will appear. So we'll say tooltip, we'll say login to Twitter, and then we have to actually specify the source of the image, and all of that is done within the config section of the control. So it expects a source element, and then we define the source. Now if you recall, when we put the image on the navigator panel, we went ahead and use the images directory. So we can just type in that in relative Twitter button. That was a JPEG. Next we'll go ahead and specify the image type. There are a few different options. So we'll say image type, and for this one it's going to be URL. It's a relative URL to where the image resides. You also have the capability to specify, for example, the database if it exists in the binary objects table, such as a person image or a project image, things of that nature. All of that's defined in the SDK. Okay, so now we can go ahead and run this just to make sure that we are at least getting the image up on the website. So let's check that out. We'll navigate back to company, and then we'll click on Twitter and see if the image comes up. So it's there, but it's not being resolved. So maybe it's something as simple as me not spelling it correctly, but at least we can see in the element properties that it does resolve to our website and then the image directory. And that should probably say images with an S. So let me go ahead and notice I'm going to leave this dialog open, and I'll just go back to the code. I'll type in S here, I'll save the document, come back, and then I can just refresh the page, and then the image appears. So you don't have to constantly close this dialog and then switch back to company and then switch back to Twitter in order to get the changes to be recognized. That will just happen. If we take a look at the page source right now, we can bring this up and see what kind of elements that are being created in order to display this image. Okay, so if we drill down into our card and then our main view, we'll get in here. Eventually what we're looking for is this table. You can see now this is kind of connecting the group type as grid, actually creating a table. And then here's our table data cell, and it contains a div that contains our image. Great. Okay, so I went ahead and taken the liberty to pause for a second and add in some more controls into our controls element underneath our image that we just created. And I'm going to go ahead and walk through this just so you don't have to see me type everything out. So I'm going to say, okay, we're going to add in a label here, and this label is going to be have a caption of username. It's of type SO label. I'm just giving it a unique ID, and I'm going to specify that this control is to reside in the first row in the first column. So what we've had so far is the image, if we look at it as a row, the image will reside here, and then now we're going to go into the next data cell, and we're going to set the label for the username here. So it'll be user label, and then we have, after that, we've created another control of type SO text box, and this is actually going to be where the user can go ahead and type in his username, right, immediately following the label. So type text box, and we've defined this as a data source, which is going to drill down into the data handler and look for a carrier object in the data carriers collection called credential entity, and then it's going to inspect that object for a username property. If it exists, it's going to go ahead and populate this text box with the value of that property. Now, we don't have this data handler created yet. We haven't created this data handler yet, so I'm just going to leave that data source empty. The config section for a text box enables me to define some properties of this text box. I'm going to specify that the edit mode of this text box is true, and some initial text that may appear when the data source is essentially empty. I'm just going to go ahead and take that off, and I just want to define this as edit mode equals true at this point. Okay, so looking at the rest of the controls, We've covered the Twitter image, we've looked at the username label, we've looked at the username text box, and now we're going to go ahead and continue down here, and let's look at the next label for the user's password. So we'll just specify the type as a label, give it a unique ID, and we're going to specify the row as well as the same as up above as 0, and we'll give it a column of 1, and then we'll specify the text box to be of type SO text box. We'll give it an ID of text password, and we'll specify the row is 0 and the column is 2. Essentially what we're going to do here is we're going to place this label in the same column or TD cell as this label. They're going to kind of lay on top of each other, and then the text boxes will do the same in the adjacent data cell. Now this one also has a data source specified to SO password, or a password inside the data handler's data carrier collection, which could contain a data carrier called credential entity with a property of password. And before I delete that out of here, since we don't have that defined yet, I'll kind of show you some of the consequences behind having this type of property here. Let me go ahead and just explain this config section again. We want this text box to also be edit enabled, so we'll set that to true, edit mode to true. I don't need any initial text, but I do want to set this text box as a password text box. So I'll just set the password property to true, and that will give me the dots instead of actually viewing the characters that I type in the text box. So I'm going to save this, and keep in mind that this data source doesn't exist. So when we come back to the 6web thing, I actually closed that dialog, so I'll go ahead and have that open back up now. It's going to open it up, and I get a bunch of errors. And the error is here in the actual dialog, and it says data handler with ID, Twitter data handler not found. So that kind of makes sense, it doesn't exist. So I'm going to go back into the code, delete this data source, I'll save that, and then I'll come back and I'll have to refresh this page and then log back in because of the error. I'll go ahead and log in. Exception was thrown. Okay, what was this problem? Reference not set to an instance of an object happens. Doesn't seem to like that very much. Oh, okay, so this page is not logged in. Okay, so now the dialog appears, and we're able to see that the images appearing. We have both the labels in the same data cell on top of each other, and then we have both the text boxes in another cell in the next data cell. Now we're kind of missing the login and the cancel buttons here, so we'll go ahead back to the code and begin to work on that. Okay, so what I've done is taken the liberty to create an additional control group underneath our initial main header group. So just below that, we've created a new control group. I've given it an ID of type dialog button bar, because here's one of those special cases where you create a new control group and it's of a different type other than SO control group. This time we're going to create a control group of type OK cancel button bar, and intrinsically, internally into this type, it knows how to render an OK cancel button on the control. So it has some position attributes here set from the top. It's going to be 100%. The height is going to be 30 pixels. From the left, 0. From the right, it's going to be 20 pixels off. And the positioning is absolute. We have the capability to define or assign a data source to this control, so that if there is any controls within this, with any other smaller controls like a button or a text box or whatever that needs to be assigned properties from a carrier in the data source, it will at least, this is a way to pass that carrier up into that control, or to this when it's rendered. In a control group of type OK cancel button bar, it's pretty rare that you're actually going to define additional controls, because it already has essentially what we expect, an OK cancel button or a delete button on it. But we're just going to go ahead and leave that empty here. The next section here, the config section, will define an entity current that can be associated with this control. So anytime the entity changes, this control's context will change accordingly and be updated with its data source. We don't necessarily need that here at this point because we're not using it. So we can go ahead and get rid of that as well as the data source, but there are no additional controls that depend on that. We're going to specify that we want the edit mode set to true, and then the OK button text is assignable here. This is actually what's going to appear on the OK button. We can also have an option to show the help button, and I'm just going to leave this set to false, but you could set this to true, and we'll take a look at how that works after. Help on click is associated with the help button. Primarily what I'm concerned here is with the OK button and the script that's going to execute when I call that. When I click on the login button, it's going to execute this JavaScript here to call into the dialog JavaScript object and invoke its close with callback method, which essentially is going to invoke the save method on the data handler, and that's our opportunity to get the values from the controls we define up above. Their data sources will automatically be synchronized with the data carrier collections and the properties that are assigned to each carrier in that collection. In the save method, you have the opportunity to persist any changes that were done here. Now, we haven't got to the data handler yet. We're going to do that in the next video. So just be aware that the dialog close with callback method by default invokes the save method on the data handler and then closes this dialog. Now there's also going to be a cancel button, which we're just going to invoke the dialog close method. The callback method set to false here. This is a default value, and we'll just leave it that. So when I click on cancel, it will just close the dialog without invoking the save method on the data handler. So you can see here that we could do some testing if we wanted to actually show the help file and then call a page update method, and this is another way to invoke the save method in the data handler, is to invoke the SO protocol Twitter login and then call into the main, which is the SO protocol up above defined in the view, and then we're going to set the mode equal to save. We could also say mode equals delete if we wanted to invoke the delete method in the data handler. We're not going to be dealing with deletes in this video series, so we're not going to worry about that. And the page update does not define any callback that we want to execute after the page update method is complete. So okay, we've added in this new control group of type OK cancel button. If I go ahead and save this now, we should be able to go back to the login dialog, just refresh it, and see some buttons here now. Great. So I'm not going to click on any of these. Let's just go back and see what happens if I say show help button. We'll set that to true. We'll save that. We'll come back, reload that once again, and then the help button appears. So you can leverage this to do some additional testing if you need to. We're not going to use that here in this case, so we'll just set that to false again. Ideally, of course, you click on this, you invoke some JavaScript that could open up help for your application. The only thing else left to cover here, I think, is if we take again up at the first control group and we scroll down to the config section of that, we'll see we have the group type set to grid and border. Now there's also some additional settings that you should probably be aware of when you are writing out these tables. Say I'll just paste that in. You'll see that we can actually define some cell heights, and then we can specify some cell widths, and this will go along for each cell that is defined or that we're leveraging here in the system. Now this is all zero based, so you can see we have one row. The first row is going to be 0, and then we have 2 columns, 3 columns, sorry. The first column is what that the image contains, 1 column for the image, and then the next column is going to contain the labels, and then finally the third column is going to contain the actual text boxes, which are defined in 2, so it's all 0 based. So we have 3 cells to deal with, and then we can go ahead and set some alignment on those as well. So if I save this and then we go back and look at the dialog, if I reload this, we'll see if there's any changes. And in fact, you did see some very little positioning changes, but we don't necessarily need that. This is a very small example, but it's nice to know that those sorts of things do exist so that you can play with those. Okay, we'll save that, reload this. Right. So now that we've created the login dialog, in the next video we're going to take a look at how to create a data handler in order to enable functionality. Thanks for watching.